Great, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'm really happy to be here. Caleb, if you could just turn down the lights and we'll jump right in. I'm going to give a little bit of my own history just to share where I'm from. I'm actually from across the lake in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I live in San Francisco now, but I grew up in Milwaukee, and I certainly have a strong connection to Audubon. I actually lived a mile away from the Schlitz Audubon Center, and that was the place where we would go to experience the outdoors when I was growing up. And so I was very excited professionally when this opportunity to work for the National Audubon Society as a scientist came up, and really saw it as a great way for me, kind of full circle, to go back to an organization that was important to me as a kid, and now I'm doing science and helping inform some of the programs that Audubon has at a national level, which is really exciting. So I want to talk initially about climate change in general. This was came out just a few days ago, a message about recent climate change from the World Meteorological Organization, the Secretary General. The global average surface temperature in 2015 broke all previous records by a strikingly wide margin. For the first time on record, temperatures in 2015 were 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above the pre-industrial era. So this year that we just experienced was actually the warmest year on record. And I think it's just indicative of the general trend that we've been observing over the past few years. Here's just a sense of how warm it was. This is looking at average temperature for each of the months of the year. And here we're seeing 2015, and these are the 5 other warmest years on record. So we're significantly above even the previous warmest years, which of course all occur just in the last decade, more or less, with the exception of 1998, which was also a really big El Nino. And climate change is not only about warming, it's also about extremes. This is from last February, so approximately a year ago, we were experiencing, at the same time, the same month, the record coldest temperatures in the eastern United States and record warmest temperatures in the western United States. And so part of climate change is just these extremes that we've never experienced before. However, the general trend is this steady increase in warming in temperatures, which kind of plateaued in the 60s but has been increasing at a steady rate since then. We can already document the impacts that this has had on birds. This is a study that was done by the National Audubon Society where we looked at the ranges, the distributions of over 300 species, and kind of looked at the middle, the centroid, or the center of that distribution, and compared where the center was in the 60s and where it was in the 2000s. And we found that on average, species had been moving approximately 40 miles north. So this is not the future, this is the past. This has already occurred. Species are already moving north. They have already moved north. This is for the winter, where we're seeing species spending the winter further north where temperatures are milder than they were in the past. And then we're also seeing species spend their winters further inland, again because temperatures are just more mild than they've been in the past. So at Audubon, we've done a huge study to try to basically address several questions or needs that we have as an organization. The first need was, wouldn't it be great if we could create a field guide to the future? Many of you might be birders, and you're accustomed to using a field guide to kind of figure out whether or not a bird is likely to occur where you're birding that day. So this is a field map that you might find in a guide like the Sibley Guide. We wanted to create a field guide to the future, the end of the century. Where would we see birds at the end of the century? Then we wanted to take that information about distributions and how they might change in the future and make conclusions about which species might be more impacted by climate change and which species might not be impacted by climate change. And that would be useful to help us do better conservation so we could focus on those species that are likely to be impacted by climate change. Then it would be great to take all those projections and identify or look at specific locations where we're doing work and see what changes might occur in that specific location. Would we see species leaving? Would we see species arriving? And what would those species be? And then finally, as a conservation organization, we wanted to be able to set priorities for places that we felt were going to be important for birds not only today, but into the future, in a future that's defined by climate change. So these were really the 4 goals that we had as an organization to integrate climate change into our work. And so we basically created maps of future climatic suitability, places where the climate is suitable for a species that has the same climates that we see to the species in today. Create lists of species that are more likely to be sensitive to climate change. Be able to give information at a local scale saying, these are the changes we expect in your town or in your important bird area. And then finally, being able to create these maps that prioritize places and tell us where we should go do conservation activities so that we can feel confident that these places are going to be important today and into the future. So these are the 4 things that I'm going to be sharing with you today to summarize sort of how we've addressed climate science and its potential impacts on birds in Audubon. Before I give you kind of the details and some of the results, I want to just kind of step back and give you a framework for understanding how we've done this type of work. So we're all used to taking photos of birds or wildlife or anything, and we think of a photo as being a representation of reality. It's highly detailed, it has lots of information, and you can glean a lot of things out of a photo. It's a representation of the truth of that moment, of this bird taking flight. However, it's true that when you're trying to identify a bird, sometimes a photo isn't actually the best way to identify a bird because it's sometimes hard to see the field marks. And so in birding, we're accustomed to working with like an image or a drawing of a bird, which more clearly shows us the key elements of that bird, the field marks basically. And so sometimes a little bit of abstraction can allow us to see the most important things and can allow us to identify a bird better than a photo, even though that photo is a representation of reality. And so I'm going to take this analogy and extend it into where I work, which is using math and statistical modeling. Sometimes a mathematical abstraction can hold that information, those key pieces of information about the relationship between a bird species and climate. What are the climates that a species prefers to live in? And we can represent that in a mathematical equation, basically a statistical model. And that's the tool that we use to predict where we would see that species in the future in a different climate. So how did we build our mathematical models? We started, as Rebecca mentioned, with citizen science data. This is data that was collected by Audubon members. Maybe some of you have been involved in a citizen science activity. Raise your hand if you participated in an Audubon Christmas bird count. Okay, so some people have. That's an activity that goes on every December where anyone can participate. It's free to participate. You just sign up and go to a specific location. It's usually organized by an individual or a group of people. They'll tell you where to go, and you'll look for birds and count how many birds you can see in that area. And then all of those counts are summed for the circle that's being counted, and then those are submitted to Audubon at the end of the year. And so this has been going on for over 100 years, actually. It's one of the longest citizen science activities in existence. So we made use of Christmas bird count data, and here you can see some of these Christmas bird count circles that are, as you can see, have a really great distribution across the United States, really good coverage, as well as Canada, even into Alaska. We made use of these data as well as some information that's collected in a different survey, which is also conducted by citizen scientists or volunteers that go out and observe birds. This other citizen science project is called the North American Breeding Bird Survey, and it's conducted in June, whereas the Christmas bird count is conducted in December and early January. So we have the winter months and the summer months, which allowed us to think about how climate change might impact birds in both of those seasons. So how is it that birds are relating to climate? How does this make sense? Well, many of you may be familiar with gardening and this idea of plant hardiness zones. You would go to your botanical garden or your Home Depot and try to figure out what plants to plant in your garden based on their tolerance of different temperatures. And so that's an example of how species, where they can live, is limited by climate. And so we can imagine these different hardiness zones for different plants. Birds are the same way. So birds are also limited by temperature, precipitation. They're also limited by kind of the seasonality. How extreme are the different seasons? those are going to create biological limits on where a species can live. What we did at Audubon was we related these bird observations to different variables characterizing climate. And we call these bioclimatic variables, and we use 17 different variables. So we took our observations, where do we see the birds? We related that to historical climate. What was the climate like when we saw these birds? And we built these models, and we did this for over 500 species. Then we needed some way to characterize the future. And to characterize the future, we looked at 3 different predictions for how greenhouse gases will be emitted into the atmosphere. How much greenhouse gases will we put in the atmosphere? There's kind of a low scenario, a medium scenario, and a high scenario for greenhouse gas emissions. And those correspond to different rates of temperature increases. So the more greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, the warmer it's going to get. And then those emission scenarios are used to run or to drive models of global climate. These models simulate the climate and predict what the temperature and rates of precipitation are going to be in the future under these different emission scenarios. So we were able to take these global climate models or gender circulation models, run under these different future emission scenarios, and create maps of future climate. We could put those into our bioclimatic models or models of where birds prefer to live, and we could create maps of future climatic suitability. So this is a lot of information. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. So this is a summary of what I just said, basically. Here's an example, and you can see these on our website. These are maps that show how a species distribution might shift or move in response to climate change. And so what you can see are actually both seasons at the same time. In yellow, you're seeing the range of the species in the summer months, and in blue, you're seeing the range of the species in winter months. And this is looping. It's an animation that loops through the year 2000, the 2020s, 2050s, and 2080s. And so you're basically seeing, where do I find the climates that this bird is found in today? Where are those climates existing in the future? And so we can see, and then we actually include kind of a solid line for, that just shows you where the species is today. That's a nice frame of reference. And we can see for this hermit thrush that things are shifting quite a bit further north in the summer as well as in the winter. So these are examples of some climate suitability maps that I was talking about earlier, and I'm going to give you many more examples to kind of give you some examples from this local area, maybe birds that you have seen here and birds that you might see in the future. But before I do that, I want to just give you an example of how we've then used this information to classify species. So we basically looked at these predictions and said, any species for which this is where we see it today, and the future includes where we see it today as well as some new areas. We're calling these climate stable. These are the species that we don't have to worry about quite so much. Because they're still going to be found where we see them today, and they might actually gain some new areas where they can live in the future. Then there's a species, you can imagine a species, here's where we see it today in this solid line, but here's where we see it in the future. Much of the places there it is today are no longer appropriate. The climate is no longer appropriate. But there's new areas, and so we call these climate threatened because it's possible that these species will do okay with climate change, but there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know if they're going to be able to move along with these changes in climate. And so we want to pay attention to these species. We want to do everything we can to protect the areas that we find them today that are likely to be suitable in the future, and we want to help them move into these new areas if we can. And then finally, you can imagine a species, this is where we can see it today, and in the future it's a much more restricted area. And so these are the climate endangered species where they could be severely impacted by climate change, so we want to pay attention to these bird species. And so the way of our over 500 species, the way we broke them down, 274 were classified as climate stable, 188 climate threatened, and 126 climate endangered. And so about half of the species we were able to model, over 500 species, half of those were either threatened or endangered. And so we concluded that climate change represents a potentially important threat to birds throughout North America. And that's one of the key cornerstones of what Audubon is doing with climate change today, trying to draw attention and saying, hey, climate change is important for many reasons, one of which is its impact on birds, and we don't want to see these birds suffering. So here's some examples. This species is the Blackburnian warbler. It's classified as climate threatened. This species is something that you would see if you were up in the UP or maybe in the very northern reaches of Michigan. And here is the projections for this species, that it will move quite a bit north into an area that currently is the boreal region of Canada. So pretty dramatic changes. And actually, this type of prediction is also the same for a whole suite of species, the wood warblers, which include many more species that are related to the Blackburnian warbler, and all of them fall into this category of climate threatened because the climates where we find these species today are predicted to be moving quite a ways into the north, into what's the boreal zone. Here's a different story. This species is the Bohemian waxwing. This is a species that actually is found in Michigan during the winter months. It comes down here to overwinter, but again, because of the milding, or the fact that winters are becoming more mild, this species is, in the future, less likely to be down here this far south over the winter. The bobolink is a grassland species that's currently found throughout the state, or in grassland areas throughout the state, and it is predicted to be shifting into further north, again into this area that currently is filled with trees. And so there's lots of uncertainties there. What's going to happen if this species finds that it needs to move further and further north because of warming temperatures, but the rate at which forest becomes grassland and provides the habitat that is needed, what if that doesn't occur at the same rate that the climate is warming? And so this species could be squeezed because there's no grasslands up there, but yet warming temperatures are pushing it further north. And so it's a climate-threatened species. Dickcissel is another grassland species. And this is a species that actually may become more common in Michigan in the future. Currently, it's only seen once in a while, and this is actually a really interesting story. A recent study came out just last year where they looked at dickcissel and actually found most dickcissels are found in this Central Plains region, but when the Central Plains experiences a drought, what we see is that more dickcissels are found in the northern periphery, so in Wisconsin and potentially in Michigan. And so with warming temperatures and increased drought coming along with future climate change, it may be that this becomes more normal and we see dickcissels in this area more frequently. And so, sorry, what I wanted to say is that this has already been observed, this process. I mean, that's what this study is about. So they've already observed this pattern of them moving, and so if these drought events become more frequent, we're just going to see more of it. Here's the summer tanager. This is a climate-stable species, but it's kind of interesting. You don't see that in Michigan. It's a beautiful red bird, but our predictions suggest that this could become a species that's much more common and actually spends its breeding season in Michigan in the future. American widgeon, this is a duck that you may be familiar with. It is often found here overwintering. It's climate endangered because of restrictions in its breeding area up here, but it is a species that might become more common in Michigan in the winter months. And a similar story for gadwall, which may become more common in the winter months here, but is also experiencing threats because of shrinking areas that are suitable for the species in the summer. So lots of examples to just show you the breadth of potential impacts of climate change, which means species leaving Michigan and species spending more time in Michigan. So we've kind of gone through these maps of the future and talked about how we can classify these species. Now I want to give you an example of how we can use these projections to show change in a specific location. We can look at across the entire continent, and for every location we can say how many species are predicted to arrive in the future by the end of the century. So here, this is looking at the summer months and the winter months. And interesting, we showed a lot of species that are arriving. It's very dark in Michigan in the winter months. There's lots of species that are potentially going to arrive in Michigan over in the wintering season. And then we mentioned how many species were moving into this boreal zone. That's why it's so dark here, because you have lots of species moving into what's now the boreal zone. And then similar, we can look at how many species are leaving. And so we can focus in on Michigan and say, well, in the non-breeding or in the winter months, we're not seeing a lot of species particularly leaving, but we are seeing potentially more species. I'm sorry, we are seeing some species that are breeding further north. And I actually ran the numbers and looked at different time periods in the future within the state of Michigan. How many species do we predict to be leaving the state, and how many species do we predict to be arriving in the state? And so it's interesting because we're looking at kind of the breeding season or summer season, roughly equal kind of initially, and then as we move forward in the century, a little bit more species leaving than arriving. And then for sort of the winter months, the opposite story, more mild temperatures, and so more species spending their winters here, and fewer species that are leaving and not spending their winters here because they're spending it further north. So potentially significant impacts within the state of Michigan in terms of the species that you find here. Okay, and then I want to talk about one last application. As a conservation organization, we're always interested in figuring out, we have limited resources. Where should we invest our time? Where should we invest our money to do conservation for birds, protecting habitat, helping their populations? Where should we put all of our limited resources so that we can feel confident that this place is going to be important not only today but in the future? And so to do that, we've built some climate prioritizations. And so trying to decide where to work is inherently more difficult than just making projections of the future. It's really trying to look across all these different sources of uncertainty. We don't know how much greenhouse gases we're going to put into the atmosphere. We don't know exactly how the climate is going to respond, and we don't know exactly how birds are going to respond. And I want to talk a little bit about that last one. We can imagine some species, we can kind of put them into categories based on how well they're able to handle new climates and how well they're able to move. So there might be a species that is not very tolerant of new climates and they're not very mobile, so those species are going to suffer. They're just going to stay where they are and things are going to get hotter and they're just going to have to make do, and we'll probably see fewer of those birds. Other species are also not very tolerant of different climates, but they are more mobile, and so this is kind of the classic response. They're going to move potentially with climate change. And then finally, we can imagine a species that is actually very tolerant of lots of different climates. Think about a crow. It can live in all kinds of climates. It's really not responding to climate change. It's really maybe associated with people. And so wherever people are, we're going to find that bird. And so these are three very different ways of responding to climate change. And so what we did is we used our projections and we kind of thought about all these different responses. We can imagine species moving into new areas that become suitable and expanding. We can imagine species that are suffering and can't really move and they're going to contract. And then we can imagine species that really don't care because they're not responding to climate change. And so we built prioritizations. We ranked everything and said, where's the best places to work based on all of these possible responses. And then we actually kind of took the most important areas from all three of those approaches, and that's our final map of these. We're going to look at all these top ranking areas, and that's where we're going to focus. Excuse me, our effort. And so we can look at these prioritizations, and we can see areas in this dark color. Those are the areas that we want to do our conservation. They have a high ranking because they're consistently important for birds today and in the future. This is this is just where we see this species. This is a wood thrush. This is where we see the species today, this black line. And so that gives us a frame of reference so that we can say, okay, here's an area of expansion where we could do some conservation. And here's an area of contraction where we might not want to do as much conservation. And so these areas that are high ranking, we're calling these climate strongholds, areas that we expect to be important for birds today and into the future. And we can combine these maps with other information about species to try to identify and really prioritize the places to do work. And I just want to give you one example where we're going to look at land cover. What types of land uses do we see? Is it agriculture? Is it grassland? Is it forest? And we're going to combine those two things. So let me show you an example. So here I'm taking a prioritization that's based on not a single species, but 85 different birds, eastern forest birds, deciduous forest birds. And so you can see these high-ranking areas in the northern parts of Wisconsin and a little bit of in the UP and in a little bit of Michigan proper. We're then going to combine it with information on land cover. So this map tells us where do we see agriculture, where do we see grasslands. You'll notice that you can hardly even see the remaining grasslands in the state of Michigan. But there are small little patches here and there. And then deciduous forest is in this sort of lighter green color, and then cities are in red. And so you can really see the impacts of cities, right? So I'm actually going to, for the first example, focus in on the forest community. So deciduous forest, we're going to pull that out. So this is all the forest. And then we're going to combine this map of where we have forest today with our priorities map. And then we can say the areas that have this blue color, those are the highest priorities. And so in the UP, we have areas of high priority to protect forests for these birds. And then in this region of Ontario, and then a little bit in New York, and then a little bit in western PA. Those are the most important areas at this regional level for protecting this forest for this group of birds. And then we can zoom in on Michigan, and like I mentioned earlier, lots of areas up here in the UP, and then there's some areas here in the northern part of this part of Michigan. And so I did the same thing for grasslands. Here I'm mapping not only grasslands but agricultural lands. So you can think of agriculture as an opportunity. We could do restoration on an agricultural field to create a grassland. So where might we want to do restoration for grassland birds? In the state of Michigan, the areas that come out high are kind of in this bluer color here. And this is based on 50 species of grassland birds. And this is the same prioritization at the continental scale. So you can see, the Great Plains obviously are most important at a continental level, but then there are areas that are important at a more regional level. So this is it for the science portion of the talk. I really just wanted to give you an overview and give you a sense how we can use citizen science to build these statistical models and predict where we might see birds in the future under a changing climate. And then think of all the things we've been able to do with that information. We've used it to classify species and identify which species we should focus on for climate change. We've used it to create information at a local scale saying these are the changes we expect in this state, and we can even do that for this important bird area or for this national park. And then we are also taking that information and creating these prioritization maps where we're able to say, these are the places at a regional level or at a state level that we should be doing conservation to have the greatest impact for birds today and in the future impacted by climate change. So we've really gotten a good bang for our buck, right? Whoa, yikes. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is just to share, and I think after we're going to hear from some groups at a very local level, what is it that people as citizens can do to start addressing this issue of climate change and its potential impacts on birds? Well, the first one is to think about what you've heard about already, these important bird areas. These are places that we've already identified as having large populations of birds, and depending on how they've been classified, some of these areas are important at a global scale. So they represent a certain proportion of that bird's global population. And so it's definitely going to be useful to continue to improve the habitat that we find in those areas, because we know that a strong population is going to be better suited to adjust to all the changes that are coming from climate change. And so doing what we can now to support bird populations in the places that we know to be important is going to only help their chances of responding to climate change. And so things that you can do in important bird areas include monitoring, restoration, and just conservation, expanding the amount of protected areas that we have. And I know that just by reviewing your website for Detroit Audubon, and even talking tonight at dinner, just hearing a little bit about some of the activities that are already going on. There's some surveying going on along the Detroit River at this International Wildlife Refuge. The Detroit River is an important bird area. There's work that's being done on black terns, which is a climate-threatened species. And so whatever we can do to support their populations is only going to help them adapt to climate change in the future. And then I saw some examples of some survey work or monitoring that's being done on grasslands. And so just keeping track of these populations and understanding whether they are doing well or whether they're whether they're in decline is useful information to help us prepare. Of course, you can also become a voice for birds. Advocacy is tremendously powerful because it can impact policies relating to climate change. And so having a voice that represents birds and saying, hey, climate change is going to impact wildlife as well as humans and our society as a whole. And so this is another way of talking about climate change. And actually, it's kind of an interesting way to talk about climate change because lots of people like birds. It doesn't necessarily break down across party lines or political lines. People's love for birds often is a cross-cutting passion. And then I guess I wanted to end by reminding you or making you familiar with the fact, if you're new to Audubon today, Audubon has a long tradition of tackling big problems. Climate change is certainly not the first big problem that Audubon as an organization has confronted and made serious progress on. Audubon was actually formed in the early 1900s in a response to the popularity of putting birds in hats. The millinery trade was using feathers and whole birds to decorate women's hats, and Audubon was an organization that helped get the Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed in 1918. We're almost on the 100th anniversary of that treaty, which was essentially a treaty that prohibited the harvesting of migratory birds. That was maybe our first major victory as an organization, but more recently, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, her work demonstrating the impacts of chemicals and pesticides in our environment, the impact that it had on birds. Audubon, as an organization, was supporting some of the science and studies that demonstrated, in particular with bald eagles, the impact of DDT on reproductive success. And so that's another example where Audubon was on the front lines addressing a major environmental issue. And we feel like this issue, climate change, is of that same magnitude, and we're trying to rally people around this issue to try to invoke change. And then, of course, I just wanted to end by saying this is a picture of myself, me and my daughter out birding, and why else would we do this but not for our kids and for future generations to be able to enjoy the amazing diversity of birds that we experience and really keep stewarding these populations for the future. It's our responsibility. So that's the end for my talk tonight. I really appreciate you coming. And I want to direct you to our website, climate.audubon.org, where you can get more information and see more maps of species and how they might be impacted by climate change. And you can also sign up to hear different activities and ways that you can get involved in the issue of climate change and its impact on birds at a national level. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.